Welcome to ThinkData, helping third sector organisations to make better use of data. Find out more at www.thinkdata.org.uk.
So a talk on standard measures and variables for the Scottish Civil Society Data Partnership project webinar. Standard measures and variables, I'm going to argue, are important things, and they're not things we necessarily will have thought about previously when dealing with data of potential value to research. To start the argument that they're important, go back to 1624, John Donne, "No man is an island." Why on earth make this point? The issue is that when we're doing research, social research, we ought always to recognize all the previous effort that's gone into studying the social processes and mechanisms that we're talking about. We shouldn't just try and proceed independently without drawing on the expertise of others. So when we're working with data, it's usually stored in the form of measures and variables. So most commonly, these are the columns basically in numeric data resources. Variables giving us information about people's circumstances. And the operationalization of these measures refers to the preparation of them for subsequent analysis, typically statistical analysis. And we can do all sorts of things with these measures. We can operationalize them in many different ways, but the relevance of thinking about standard measures and variables is about taking advice from previous work, previous researchers, influential organizations, on the appropriate ways of constructing measures, so setting standards and using them. Thinking about standard measures and variables is important for two reasons, scientifically and also more pragmatically. Scientifically, it's easy to see why you get higher quality research data. You've also got better chances of replicability, repeatability, clear documentation and communication of what you've done if you're using standard and agreed variable operationalizations and measures. Pragmatically, though, as well, it's easier, ultimately, to take advice from other experts and to use the standard formats and recommendations in other contexts. We've got a few specific notes on some of these things in some of our workshop materials. If you look up Workshop 1 on the website, you can download materials reflecting on socioeconomic circumstances, measuring voluntarism, and measuring protected characteristics, circumstances of people that are related to the Equality Human Rights Act. I'm going to comment on two general topics. First of all, how to find out about standards from different sources. And then secondly, a little bit about implementing standards. There's many different providers that will give you information on appropriate standards to use, and an important one to highlight would be National Statistics Institutes, NSIs. In the UK, we've got, for example, the Office for National Statistics. We've also got devolved National Statistics Institutes, Scottish Government, for example. And we've got affiliated projects and resources connected to national statistics agencies. The Administrative Data Liaison Service and PADLs, which is their resource for distributing information about standard measures and variables, are useful in this respect. At these sorts of places, you'll get recommendations and advice, typically developed during the process of collecting data. So decisions made about how to record data through the census, the UK census, tend to be important in social statistics because the census codes tend to get used subsequently in other surveys and studies. Here I'm showing ethnicity as it's measured in Scotland in the 2001 and 2011 censuses. Slightly different categories available in the two time periods. But the point is, the decision to measure ethnicity in this way was a long and extended methodological evaluation from National Statistics Institutes in the UK. But once it was made, it then becomes a situation that this defines a standard measure of ethnicity, and it's a particularly sensible one to use unless you have good reason not to in most situations. Other things as well from which you could get information about standard measures and variables. As well as National Statistics Institutes, you can also consider secondary survey studies, large-scale surveys that have been conducted and then made available for research use by other people. If you go to something like the UK Data Service and access information about previous surveys, you have the possibility of downloading the data, but you also have lots of documentation on the contents of those surveys, including materials associated with what was known as the Survey Question Bank, which was a listing of questions asked on surveys. Questions in all sorts of forms, whether commonly measured things that are found in most social surveys or things that are more particular to a particular research interest. But it's nearly always better practice to look up how things have been measured and coded and operationalized in other survey studies, and probably just use those measures. That's usually better than trying to come up with something yourself, reinventing a measure and not having the benefit of the extended methodological expertise that was used in the original survey context. So looking at secondary surveys as templates for standard measures and variables, templates of good practice and of sensible recommendations is a good idea. Another category of data providers are methodological materials and Statistics Institute's recommendations with an orientation to cross-national comparative analysis. This is quite a big part of social science these days. Many data resources span more than one country, and people spend time thinking about appropriate ways of recording data for the purpose ultimately of harmonizing and comparing between different countries. Things like the OECD have recommendations and measures of a whole load of social science concepts. Academics write about appropriate strategies for harmonizing and recording data across countries. Again, thinking about how people have approached the challenge of recording data in a consistent way in standard measures for the purpose of cross-national analysis is useful, even if you're not necessarily thinking in those terms with your own data. But drawing upon a cross-nationally agreed standard can be a very sensible, plausible strategy. There's also other academic material discussing standard measures and variables and making recommendations and suggestions. Academics don't always agree on everything, of course, in these areas, but common themes in most of the methodological literature include the benefit of being reasonably disciplined in working with data, and by that I mean if there is an existing standard out there, it's sensible to use it rather than be tempted to modify it or invent your own measure. So if you want to record, say, ethnicity or education level, you're better off looking at national standards and using those coding frames rather than constructing your own. Methodologists would also often highlight a concept of sensitivity analysis when operationalizing variables and choosing standards. Sensitivity analysis basically in this context refers to trying out quite a few different plausible measures or variable operationalizations of the data that you've got, and comparing and contrasting the results, documenting to what you've done. So say, for example, it's education level that you're interested in, you've got some data on qualifications people have. There's actually quite a lot of different ways that you could code that for analytical purposes. Sensitivity analysis would refer to coding it in a dozen different ways, recording them all and comparing them all, and that's likely to improve the quality and the accuracy of your findings. Methodologically as well, and talking about standard measures, we'd always stress, in the academic literature, we'd always stress the importance of clear documentation and information. academics themselves are not always the most disciplined when working with social science data resources. They often just do their own thing anyway. They often make a decision that they think they know a better way of doing things than the standard approach. And the academic literature is full of analyses that don't make use of recommended standards, often successful in the sense that it's interesting to people and has impact, but makes life harder in terms of the consistent development of debate and discussion. Nice example in the UK recently, a lot of attention to a survey study on social class inequalities that was conducted a couple of years ago, known as the Great British Class Survey. In that case, the authors reinvented a measure of social class based upon some analysis of data that they had. This was interesting and exciting research, but it had its drawbacks to people working on social inequality and social class, because the measure proposed by this research was not a standard measure and didn't engage easily with other literature and other approaches. So things don't always work as smoothly as ideally they might. So it's easy enough to find out about recommended standards, and hopefully you would be motivated to follow them whenever it's reasonably possible. The construction of data that is consistent with recommended standards and its use in analysis, the practical implementation does have some challenging aspects to it. In an ideal world, when you construct a standard measure, you do so with clear documentation. Typically, in the world of quantitative data analysis, larger scale quantitative data analysis in the social sciences, people would be using the software for this purpose, and they'd be using command syntax to write out what they're doing in order to construct the standard measure and use it in analysis. Perhaps sensitivity analysis constructing several measures. This is doable, but it's quite hard work. It does require a fair bit of programming, typically in software language, connecting together the data and supplementary metadata about the relevant concept. In an ideal world, things are written out with command syntax in a clear way and are connected clearly to published recommended measures. Published metadata about units. So typically things that we would refer to as index files or translation matrices. These would be coding frames. These would be bits of data published elsewhere, typically available online, that tell us what's the appropriate way to code this particular description of educational qualifications or occupations or whatever. So say, for example, you have a long listing of educational qualification titles that represent qualifications that people hold. You'll be able to pick up a published translation matrix that tells you if somebody has, say, an O-level, this would be categorized as educational level 3 in a national schema of educational attainment. A lot of these are ideals. In practice, it is a bit of work to consistently record and document the construction of standard measures and variables in this sort of model. And it's not always possible as well, possibly in terms of access to software resources. Sometimes people do this in a more ad hoc way as well. Sometimes also the data itself doesn't lend itself to using the standard measure that's recommended typically for the population as a whole. So quite a common situation in specialist projects is that the standard measure, which would have a spread of responses across a national level population, is much more skewed for the subpopulation that's being looked at. Say the occupational distribution. Nearly everybody in the population that's being studied is in quite advantaged jobs, perhaps. In such situations, it can be reasonable to make small adaptations to standard measures, for example, recoding, merging together a number of the sparsely represented categories. But again, in an ideal world, if that sort of thing is done, that should be clearly documented and justified at some stage in the process, or recording information of why that was done and how it was done. So we construct variables as much as possible on the basis of advice about previously recommended standard measures. It's much better to use standards than to generate our measures in an ad hoc way. But the way in which we've represented data through measures is also an important consideration in the analysis of data, as well as its construction. And there's at least two things worth highlighting in terms of data analysis with standard measures and variables: the themes of equivalence and of context. The theme of equivalence is essentially to what extent does the meaning of the measure that you've got hold consistently over different time periods or countries or wider contexts in a number of different ways. So if you categorize somebody as belonging to the highest level of education in their country, does that work consistently? Does that have the same meaning as if they had the same level of qualification in another country or in another time period? Broadly speaking, there's two models of equivalence: measurement equivalence and functional equivalence. Measurement equivalence would be an assertion of the intrinsic comparability of a categorical position. So a university degree is a university degree is a university degree. It has the same meaning whether it was obtained in 1930 or 2010, whether it was obtained in Britain or Kenya, etc. Functional equivalence, however, would take a slightly different approach and would say the important thing is the relative meaning of that position, the relative within the appropriate context, within the national or temporal sample context. So arguably, the relative meaning of having a degree in the UK in 2010 isn't the same as the relative meaning of having a degree in Kenya in 1930, for instance. A functional equivalence approach requires a bit more thought and consideration, but it can be more persuasive. You might be looking at some sort of arithmetic standardization operation, working out the proportion of people that have a degree in the two different contexts and giving the degree measure a score that's relative to the proportion. So the anticipation is the relative value of a degree in Kenya in the 1930s was much higher than the relative value of a degree in contemporary UK. I'm trying to illustrate that actually in the graph shown in this image, where we see even just for contemporary data from the UK, younger and older birth cohorts have higher levels of have different levels of prevalence of different educational qualifications. Younger birth cohorts are much more likely to have, for example, degree level qualifications. They're much less likely to have no qualifications. So this is a comparability issue. Do these qualification levels really mean the same for different birth cohorts? Do we want to adjust for that? As well as the equivalence consideration, there's also the contextual background to particular measures. Are there other important correlated factors that, if we're wanting to understand, say, the influence of education, should there be other things that we control for, such as wealth, family background, other important factors that are really the driving force of the measure? So we might observe correlations with education, but does that really reflect the impact of education? Could it be something else that's relevant? So in summary, standard measures and variables, it's important to recognize that almost everything that we might be measuring probably has some previous history of operationalization. Whenever possible, you're better checking up other studies and following their measures when they're available. Look at recommended guidelines on standard measures and implement them if you can. It's also quicker if you start doing this. Ultimately, it's a more efficient use of data resources, improves quality, reduces the chances of errors. It is important, I'm trying to illustrate in this graph, variations in the results you can get from different operationalizations of measures. Some of these are standard measures, some of these are more ad hoc. We're looking at correlations between different measures that are all connected to socioeconomic background and voluntary society activity or not-for-profit employment. Quite big differences in the correlations you'd get depending on which measure you use. So the impact of thinking about standard measures and variables, trying to use existing standards, is potentially considerable. Always good practice. I know it's not always an easy thing to be thinking about, but if you're trying to bring the quality standards that have been developed in academic research to other areas of research data, the argument I'm trying to make here is one of the most important dimensions of that is about the operationalization of variables, decisions about how you code and record data, and whenever possible the recommendation would be to think about looking up previous examples and using previous standards in this.